It's great to welcome to the program today Henry Giroux, who is the chaired professor of scholarship in the public interest at McMaster University. His most recent book is Race, Politics, and Pandemic Pedagogy, published this year by Bloomsbury. It's so great to have you on. I appreciate your time today.
I'm delighted to be here.
So, there's been many political analyses made of this authoritarian slide that we've seen that we could say led up to the election of Donald Trump in 2016, but then also was further fomented by the election of Donald Trump in 2016. I'm interested to hear from you more your thoughts on the cultural aspect of this and how far back you think the kind of catalysts for this slide go and how we should sort of be conceiving of it.
I think we've seen political and cultural extremism in the United States. It has a long history. We've seen it with the McCarthy period. We saw it with the Red Scare. And then, of course, there's the legacy of colonization. There's the wiping out of indigenous populations. There's Jim Crow. There's slavery. And I think that one of the things that this country has failed to confront is not only that legacy, but how it tends to reappear in different forms in different historical moments. And I think that where I see an enormous turning point in the United States is in the 1970s. All of a sudden, it seems to me there's a counter-revolution emerging against the 60s, against the democratization of the social order, against the attempt to, in some way, eliminate massive inequalities in wealth and power. And with Reagan, something happens. And what happens is there's an enormous shift in cultural values. And that shift moves away from supporting the public good to basically, in many ways, destroying it and claiming that the market now should be the template, not simply for judging the economy or managing the economy, but for all of social life. This has an enormously destructive consequence, it seems to me, in the United States. And it begins to give rise to far right-wing movements who, for the most part, hate the public good, hate the common good, and all of a sudden find themselves on the side of reproducing echoes of history that are pretty dangerous, whether we're talking about right-wing extremism, racial purity, misogyny, militarism, ultranationalism. All these forces begin to become very visible and come to the surface in light of the increasing misery that I call neoliberalism or gangster capitalism produces as a result of the 1980s.
When I spoke to Noam Chomsky a couple of months ago, the political points that he thought were relevant in that period you're talking about include, as a reaction to the civil rights movement, the establishment of the war on drugs, for example, the fight against Roe v. Wade, and that some of these points led to what the Republican Party became in the early 90s under Newt Gingrich. And then we can sort of like follow the political line. Culturally, though, what was it about those things that were happening prior to, during, and after the 70s that kind of changed this American right wing?
What you begin to see culturally are a couple of things. Ideologically, you see an ideology of self-interest emerging, reproduced in many ways in celebrity culture and consumerism. Citizenship takes on a very different form culturally after the 1980s. All of a sudden, the obligations of citizenship have to do with consumerism. The mall becomes the temple of the state, so to speak. But you also see something else. You see a rise in what I call the punishing state and a decline of the social state. And with that comes a number of cultural apparatuses that begin to reinforce what I call the most insidious cultural aspect of neoliberalism or gangster capitalism, and that is the individualization of problems. Everything becomes privatized. All problems are a matter of individual responsibility. And what that means culturally is it becomes increasingly difficult for people to translate private troubles into larger systemic considerations. So the social begins to collapse. Now, what happens as a result of that culturally? What happens is you have the war on drugs. You have, of course, Clinton's war on the welfare state. You have the Southern strategy. All of these things combine a question of racial purity and what I call white supremacy with the logic of capitalism. Somebody has to be blamed. And who has to be blamed are immigrants, are blacks, are young people, all those groups that are relatively powerless in the face of this overwhelmingly political and cultural apparatuses. Now, David, there's something else. And I think the other side of this is what we have to understand is that education takes a radical turn in the 1980s. It increasingly becomes privatized, commodified, undermined, defunded. And all of a sudden, we're not talking about educating people to be critical, engaged citizens anymore. We're talking about teachers to teach for the test.
Yep.
This runs through a whole range of presidents. I mean, the Republican and the Democratic parties both share a notion of education that is anti-intellectual, destroys the civic imagination, imposes what I call a pedagogy of repression, and basically increases an anti-intellectualism that is in the schools and in the larger cultural apparatuses. Second point, don't confuse schooling with education. Schooling is an institution that we know of, public, higher, but education takes place in other spheres. The new social media, the digital media, the rise of what I call an oracular, image-based culture. And these are largely controlled by the right. And so you have this tsunami of anti-intellectualism, right-wing nonsense, lies, misinformation, conspiracy theories emerging since the 1970s, and you find their endpoint in Trump.
I want to get back to the education piece because
Sure.
I have so many notes about it. One small thing that I was thinking of in your cultural idea of the kind of individualization of problems, is this related to the gun issue in the United States in this specific sense, that unlike in many other countries, too many people in the U.S. see guns as a way to solve problems that are really systemic problems, but they say, I will solve individually this problem with a firearm?
I think it's a brilliant analysis, and I think it's right on target. I think that basically when you individualize problems, you say that people have to are both responsible for those problems individually and have the right to engage them in ways that suggest that the government is the enemy of freedom rather than something that could be useful in dealing with these issues. The other side of this is that when you individualize problems in this way, you can't address them systemically, so you begin to increasingly criminalize social problems. So, if youth are, for instance, acting out in schools, the principal doesn't come down and say, hey, come on, let's talk. You call the police. And all of a sudden you have little 5-year-olds in handcuffs in kindergarten. So it seems to me with this increasing criminalization of social problems, you have a notion of freedom emerging that is completely removed from any notion of social responsibility.
Right.
A notion of freedom that simply says, I can do what I want. Self-interest is all that matters. All problems are individualized. This is what I call the individualization of the social. And the social sphere and the social contract and the social good and the public good, David, begin to collapse. We lose those sites where people can understand the interconnections that make a democracy possible. Couple that with an education and schooling system that basically produces new forms of civic illiteracy, and you don't have a democracy anymore, because you can't have a democracy without informed citizens.
So on education, I frequently will get calls from viewers. I mean, listen, talking about individualizing things, I will get calls from viewers who say, my cousin, my uncle, whoever, they've fallen for false beliefs about vaccines. They've fallen for false beliefs about, it doesn't matter what, but they're not thinking, they've fallen for it. How do I talk them out of it? And I struggle to say anything other than, at the individual level, it can take weeks or months of really getting someone to re-examine their beliefs. That's like a retail strategy. It's not a wholesale strategy. My instinct is it's too late. And really, if people learned critical thinking and media literacy and epistemology in middle school, we prevent this from even happening in the first place to some degree. Not with everybody, but maybe we give people the tools to not fall into this in the first place. Is that a fair critique of at least a piece of what's wrong with the educational or schooling system, as you call it today?
No, I think it's an important piece. I mean, it's foundational in that the way we educate people says something about the kind of agents we produce and the kind of future we want. And it seems to me that education and schooling in that sense is very long term. I think the other side of this is that, how do we talk about taking control of these cultural apparatuses that basically are disimagination machines? I mean, we're not just talking about, how do you say it, the ability to get people to think critically or rationally or to be able to engage other positions. That's important. But we're also talking about larger systemic apparatuses that need to be challenged by people like us, like in social movements, and reproduced in ways that give people the opportunity to be able to recognize that the most fundamental questions are not whether they're falling for lies, but what kind of future do they want for their children? Do they want health care that's free? Do they want to be in debt for the rest of their lives? Critical consciousness matters, but it has to translate, ideas have to translate and be wedded to power. And it seems to be when we remove the question of power from the question of insight, we fall into a trap that we unconsciously reproduce that we may want to stay away from. And that is to say, well, just talk to each other. No, I'm sorry. It's not about just talking to each other. It's about changing the very institutions that have put us there in the first place. And that's not just the burden of people who are confused. That's a political obligation that we all have to engage in with those people, hopefully.
So in that sense, I mean, when you hear these very superficial narratives of part of the problem is left and right don't engage anymore, or the dialogue has coarsened, this type of stuff, does that not really strike you as particularly important?
That's a diversion. I find it as a political diversion because it doesn't deal with fundamental questions like, look, what's the result of massive inequality in the United States and where does it come from?
Right.
What does it mean when some people are trading medicine for food stamps? What does it mean when schools are collapsing? That's not a matter of whether the right and left can talk to each other. That's a matter of how do we talk about democracy as a country if we're going to take democracy seriously? And what are the forces that are undermining it? These are very different kinds of questions. What does it mean to live in a country where economic activity is removed from social cost? What's the consequence of that? And how does it bear down on our lives? The last thing is that we have to be able, shame is a terrible pedagogical tool. I think shaming people does nothing but just reinforce the worst divisions. And I think the real question here for all of us is how do we begin to use a language in which people can recognize themselves, in which we can shift consciousness in ways in which people can say, yeah, that makes sense to me, without putting their identities on trial. We need a language that's rigorous, accessible, in order to make something meaningful, to make it critical, to make it transformative.
Can you give an example of that in terms of, on any issue, could you give an example of the wrong way that the language is being used and then how it could be improved?
I think in talking to people that, for instance, are dealing with schools, people will often say schools are failing, it's terrible, I think we should homeschool. And one of the questions I always raise is that if school is so crucial, do you think school is crucial to democracy, to your life, for your children? Yes. Then why is it being defunded? Schools aren't failing, they're being defunded. I mean, the problem is not that schools are failing. The problem is that they actually serve a very important purpose in society. And we have to ask ourselves, why do people want to destroy them? And why do some people have access and you don't? What can we do to make schools matter in your community? How would we do that together? How would we speak to that? How would we make schools more richer? What resources do we need? What policies? What does it mean to get on a school board? Can we do that in order to change your curriculum so that you have, for instance, free meals for your kid in the morning? Kid who's starving can't learn. Sorry.
Right.
Teachers who have 47 kids in a class can't learn. So I think when we start to deal with particulars and make them resonate with the very conditions that people can recognize in their lives, we make something meaningful to make it blah, blah. I'll give you one last example. People often say to me, why don't you come to the United States, come back? And I say, well, when you get national health care? And they say, what do you mean? I say, look, I've had 2 knee surgeries. I haven't paid a pen. I don't pay a cent. My drugs are basically free. I can walk into a corner doctor's office, a drop-in center, and get free medical care. And they don't believe this stuff. And, when I say, most debt in the United States is now due to medical expenses.
Right.
I mean, and I know, just recently, one hospital, I think in Tennessee, charged somebody $6,750 for 3 tests for coronavirus. This sort of thing has to be talked about and illustrated, and then in some way connected to people's lives.
In terms of the language that we're seeing, to sort of shift back a little bit to the earlier part of the conversation, Federico Finkelstein from the New School, regularly, a fellow Argentinian, I might add, he has written a lot about the analogous language between, past authoritarians and dictators and the kind of modern language of Trump, et cetera. Two-part question. One, to what degree do you see the language as analogous? And two, are these politically astute comparisons to be making from a practical perspective, even if they are true?
I think they're absolutely practical, and I know his work, and I know him, and I think that if we can't learn from the past, as the old saying goes, we're more than doomed to repeat it. We might find ourselves in places that we never could imagine could happen. We might find ourselves faced with the unthinkable. And I think that when we talk about ultranationalism, we talk about militarism. I mean, we talk about, for instance, the 1930s and the 40s. One of the things that we have to make clear is simply because what I call fascist politics emerges but doesn't present itself in an exact replica does not mean it doesn't exist. It means that it's always in remission but tends to emerge in different forms. And I think that what we have to look at are the signals. We have to look at the similarities, and certainly he's absolutely right, as is Timothy Snyder, Jason Stanley, and a number of others who were saying, hey, look at this language, lies. How central were the question of lies for instance, in the Nazi regime? Racial purity, racial cleansing. What does that tell us? Where did that go in the 1930s and 40s? The appeal to militarism, hypermasculinity, the attack on women's bodies, the attack on others, the friend-enemy distinction, the ongoing attempt to demonize people and to claim that the public sphere is only for white people. My God. I mean, if that doesn't conjure up an image of the past and echoes of the past that we should take seriously, then if you don't believe in that analysis, you're going to have to end up in a cell somewhere before you actually realize that fascist politics is here, alive, well, and throbbing. Think about the January 6th attack. I mean, even Robert O. Paxton, who's the great historian of fascism, who said, no, Trump is not a fascist, has come out recently and said, I was wrong. I'm sorry, the line has been crossed. We are basically now in a fascist culture, and fascist politics is on the rise of the United States and represents a very dangerous moment.
The latest book from Henry Giroux is Race, Politics, and Pandemic Pedagogy, published by Bloomsbury. We've been speaking with Henry Giroux, chaired professor for scholarship in the public interest at McMaster University. It's been so great having you on. I can't tell you how much I appreciate your time today.
Oh, thank you, David. It's a pleasure.